Hi, this is Paul, and this is Rough Draft for Sunday, where I run through the current version of my Sunday sermon. There's a massive shift about 500 years ago, all the way up to the present, with respect to a lot of basic assumptions about miracles, God's agency in the world. You had the Enlightenment, you had early modernity, you had the Protestant Reformation. All of these things had massive impacts on our assumptions, as we mentioned a few weeks ago, what Emil Durkheim calls social facts. A lot of this impacted our assumptions about God as as a relationally available actor in the world around us. And many questions rise up. Does God answer prayer and change the world? Do angels visit and give inside information or make predictions or give special announcements? Are there special people that God talks with or sends angels to? And how should their messages or claims of these things be regarded by us? Now, this is actually a tremendous topic, and obviously I cannot cover the entire thing in this sermon, but it very much impacts the passage that we're going to see today. And there's been a long history of discussing this and trying to work our way through this. Now, in the ancient world, of course, everybody understood that the world was subject to God or the gods. And so they were constantly trying to figure out how to relate to the gods, figure out what the gods were doing, appease the gods. Everyone from Roman emperors to slaves, this was constantly on their mind and constantly a source of quite a bit of anxiety. They were seeking divine favor and protection. Often gods were working against each other. If you want to read a classic tale of this, just read the Iliad. In a world filled with such public claims, there was a healthy degree of skepticism about it because, of course, if everybody's concerned about this, then everybody has their own opinions of it. And some people will claim divine revelations and other people just scoff at them. And pretty much everybody sort of looks at each other and says, well, let me see if your claims actually pan out. And people would either rise or fall, have authority or lose status, depending on whether or not claims actually panned out. People judge those who made claims by their track record to evaluate if they should be listened to in the future. Now, we're just about done with the book of Acts, and as I've noted many times, the book of Acts is a book about sermons. There's sermon after sermon after sermon in this book by Peter, by Paul, and they're given to audiences of audiences in Jerusalem at Pentecost, audiences in synagogues, and Paul's been giving these presentations and these defenses before kings and governors. And now suddenly, almost to the end of the book, we get chapter 27. Paul is being transported from Caesarea to Rome to make his appeal to the emperor, and of course he's got to make his way there. But in the ancient world, these kind of journeys were dangerous. They're often made by sea. By sea was often considered was quite a bit faster, also considered often safer, but certainly not all that safe. And what's interesting is that in this book of sermons, well, what's sort of Luke's point of this story? Well, how does it fit in? Now, one of the first things we should notice is that Luke seems to be an eyewitness to these events. Paul has been in custody for at least 2 years, and the Romans didn't really support their prisoners. Friends and family had to come in and feed them and take care of them. So it seems that Paul has had a steady stream of visitors, of friends and other people from the church who would come and support him, probably with gifts and bring him food and keep him company and probably facilitate the letter writing that he likely did. We likely only have just a tiny fraction of his letters. Now, Paul, of course, appealed his case. That was the riot that happened at the temple, appealed it to Caesar in Rome, and it's time to ship Paul to Rome, and friends are going to go along. When it was decided that we should sail for Italy, Paul and some of the other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded a ship from Adramyttium, about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia, and we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. Now, there's a lot of discussion and commentaries about the details of this. It was quite likely that these ships, which would carry cargo, because it was far easier to carry cargo by sea than over land, especially before railroads. but they would take on passengers. And so while Paul was sort of being hauled there by the Romans, others of Paul's friends could pay their own fare and then go along and accompany Paul and keep him company and care for his needs. Now, many of these ships sort of hugged the coast because they didn't want to get too far away from the coast and out there into the open Mediterranean Sea. And so they just kind of hit one point after another and take provisions, pick up new passengers, let off other passengers, and they just sort of make their way around. And here's a map of the Eastern Mediterranean and something like the trip that he would take. So this first boat would go from Caesarea to Sidon, touch there in Cyprus, and then to Myra, in what today is modern-day Turkey, then was called Asia. The next day we sailed to Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so they might provide for his needs. So they stopped off there, and Paul was able to visit friends. It seems like Julius understood that Paul's not a dangerous criminal and not a flight risk. Paul himself appealed to Caesar, and he's going to make sure that nothing happens to Paul. And he's gotten a chance to get to know Paul, and so we'll get a sense of his estimation of Paul and who Paul is and what he's about. There we put out to sea again and passed by the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. So we made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Cnidus, where the wind did not allow us to hold our course. We sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Salmone, or Salmone. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens, near the town of Lasea. Now, as you can see, they sort of made their way over to Crete, but the sailing has been difficult, and they're getting increasingly anxious about it. And of course, time of year will be a pretty important thing. Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because now it was after the Day of Atonement. So Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring about great loss to ship and cargo, and to our own lives also." But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that they should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete facing both southwest and northwest. Now, this has caused a lot of speculation to try and figure out, well, exactly where was this and what harbor. For our purposes, it doesn't really, we don't really need to know. But what you can see is they wanted to go just a little distance because the harbor was unsuitable. Paul was giving them warnings, and Paul was basically saying, hey, look, we can lose ships, we can lose men, but what was Paul's expertise in this? And so while the centurion certainly seemed to be favorably disposed to Paul, he was going to listen to the pilot and the owner of the ship and not Paul because, well, Paul's not really much of a seagoing expert. And then things begin to happen. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity, so they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore to Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force, called a nor'easter, swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind. So we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. Probably the lifeboat was behind it and was threatened to sort of get lost, so they'd haul it up into the ship. It was a decent-sized ship, at least for the ancient world. So the men hoisted it aboard. Then they passed, and it's interesting, all the detail that Luke includes. Now, this would have been a very dramatic thing, and he would have been paying very close attention, not just to sort of the relationships and the gospel mission, which is usually what he pays attention to, but he's paying all sorts of attention to the details of this ship's journey. They passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together. So again, those ropes would strengthen the ship because you want the ship to hold together in these storms with waves battering it. Because they were afraid they would run aground on the sandbars at Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. So now it's not a matter of getting the cargo there safely. The cargo obviously weighed something, probably a grain liner that's going from Alexandria, the Roman Empire's second largest city. And of course, Egypt is the breadbasket. So they're bringing all of that grain from Egypt up to Rome to feed Rome. And that grain's heavy. So now it's like, well, we're going to, we're going to take a total loss. So we got to start pitching grain, which of course shows the extreme situation where this whole enterprise is probably now a losing venture, and they're just trying to get out of it with their lives. On the third day, so now they're on the third day. So this is getting battered for a couple of days. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. Now, things are really serious. And, forget sailing and all of those kinds of things. We just have to lighten the load so this ship can keep making it. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. So in other words, they're thinking they're all dead. Now, again, why does Luke write this story? Well, there's a lot of famous ship storm stories in the world, actually. Odysseus, and the book that follows the Iliad, is in many ways one big sailing story where Odysseus tries to get home, and there are various storms that rise, and the Iliad has that. And of course, all throughout Homer, you have this question of fair winds, and of course, Agamemnon sacrifices his daughter for fair winds. These are very big deals. But even in the Bible, there's two other pretty significant sailing stories. One, of course, involves Jonah, who's running away from God because he doesn't want God to save Nineveh. And the other is Jesus himself, who's asleep in a storm on the Sea of Galilee. Now, there's just a very vivid memory that Luke just can't help but share the story. Well, I'm sure there's some of that to that. But again, this is a book of sermons, and so why this story in the book? Does it contribute to the overall question of Paul being a witness to the people? Well, I think it does. After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourself this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost, only the ship will be destroyed. Last night an angel of God, whom I belong and who I serve, stood before me." Now, what makes this story sort of like Jonah's story is that in Jonah's story too, you have this prophet of Israel and you have these pagan sailors, and there's this relationship between the prophet of Israel and the pagan sailors. And that's a big part of that chapter in Jonah and that sea storm story. That's pretty important in the book of Jonah. Of course, they will throw Jonah overboard at his own request because the storm has arisen because he is running away from God and God is angry. Now, pagans would have very much understand if you anger the gods, you're going to get a storm and the gods may kill you. That, of course, is why Agamemnon sacrifices his daughter for fair winds. So how do the Christians fit into this? And how does Paul fit into this world? So an angel comes to Paul, and this is the message from the angel. "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you." So, in other words, it's God's mission that Paul get to Rome. He's going to get to Rome. He's going to get before Caesar. And as an added perk, God's going to get everyone else there too. "And you will be my witnesses, even in a storm. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me." Now, I'm sure for the sailors, this is welcome news that at least a God out there, they have some word from someone, but there's probably a fair amount of skepticism about this because, again, people have all sorts of ideas, they make all sorts of claims. And Paul adds, "Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island." And so now it's interesting because earlier sort of Paul gets overruled by the experts, but Paul receives this divine visitation from an angel and receives encouragement on the mission, and a gift, which is basically called a gift. It's sort of the same word that you use, some same root word that you use for spiritual gifts, but this is a gift of grace from God. Now, on behalf of Paul, God has granted that no lives will be lost from those on the ships. We get a little bit of vicarious atonement. Because of God's graciousness to Paul, well, everyone on the ship will be saved. And now, of course, some people would say, well, if God's going to be gracious to Paul, why doesn't he not send the storm? Yeah, that's a good question, but God usually sets this thing up, and so, well, there's going to be a drama involved. Now, some might read this and think Paul is a Mary Sue. Well, what is a Mary Sue? A Mary Sue is sort of a character who's sort of has unreal powers. A little bit of behind the scenes here. This was a slide from a previous version of the sermon, and I sort of changed up the introduction, and because probably most people in my church aren't going to understand what I say is Paul Luke's Mary Sue. A Mary Sue is a type of female character that arises out of fan fiction who is depicted as unrealistic, lacking in flaws or weakness. And I could understand someone listening to this story and wondering about this. Well, in Fair Harbors, Paul just expresses his judgment. But now Paul has received a revelation telling him that the storm will not kill him or his crew. And again, there's some interesting differences between Jonah's storm and Jesus' storm. Storms happen in all of them. It seems at least implied in Jonah's storm that, well, God sent the storm to orchestrate those events, and, well, there's a lot that comes out of that. The pagan sailors receive a witness to God, and of course, the whole story of Jonah flows on that. The storm gets sent, and Jesus stills it, and then Jesus is shown as stilling the sea and the storm. So in each sense, the storm has an important function to play in terms of revelation of God's power and also revelation of the people involved, Jonah, Jesus, and now the Apostle Paul. Now some might wonder, does this sort of act of divine favor create passivity? And that's often a thing that's thought of today, but you don't tend to find that assumption in the ancient world. And we sort of wonder, is this favor or a gracious gift? Throughout the Bible, you see sort of an easy interchange of sort of unconditional statements and then people having to show agency all along the way, even though this unconditional promise had been given. There doesn't seem to be a real conflict between God's agency and Paul's agency in this. Paul and the people will be saved, the angel declares, but there's plenty of negotiation that's going to go along with this, and it's by no means a non-human story. This clearly does not lead to passivity in Paul, as we'll see. Paul is going to gain credibility with those around him, and, I think, a degree of authority. On the 14th day, so remember, the last check-in was the 3rd day, and they've gone on now 11 days more in a storm, and you've just got to imagine that these people are terrified and frazzled to bits, but apparently not Paul. On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea. Now, the distance between the last recorded stop and where they finally end up is 475 miles. That's no small journey to be driven by a storm. When about midnight, the sailors sensed they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. In short, later they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. Now you see here, you have the sailors' expertise that is at play here. It's the sailors. They didn't get divine revelation that land was coming. The sailors probably heard breakers, or the sailors were used to this kind of environment and figuring things out. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved." That's interesting. You see, Paul very much as an active agent in all of this. And it's not really sort of an angel came to me and said they're fooling me. Paul's just reading the situation. It says, you better watch these guys, because first chance they get, they're going to take off in this lifeboat, and we're all doomed because we actually need the expertise of the sailors. So again, God's agency and human agency really aren't in collision with each other. So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it drift away. I'm sure the sailors weren't too happy, but they're not going to really stand up against these Roman soldiers. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. In the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. Maybe we have a little sermon in here too. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You will need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair on your head. This is probably hyperbole. After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Why did he say it this way? Now that launches a big discussion. Well, is he performing the Eucharist? No, but there's overtones here that Jesus is there on the boat with them and has never left them or forsaken them. You might say, well, how was Jesus on the boat? Did angels keep popping in? No, because remember, agency isn't quite the way we usually imagine it. So he took bread and gave thanks to God in front of them. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. So, of course, they kept some grain. They were eating some grain. Now, the ship's going to be lost. You might as well make the best of it. Get rid of all the grain. Here we go. Let's go for a landing. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach. There they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea, and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind. Guess they didn't throw all the tackle over, there's some left, and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow stuck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. So they made it all the way to Malta, south of Italy. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. For Roman soldiers, to lose a prisoner meant losing your life. And so, well, it's better to explain that, well, we had a shipwreck and, we couldn't, risk losing the prisoners, so we just killed them. Well, that, of course, puts Paul in real jeopardy. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. So again, vicariously, they all keep their lives because of Paul. He is a savior for them in this case. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on other pieces of ship. In this way, everyone reached land safely. All because of Paul. Paul saved them from the storm and saved them from the soldiers. Now, why does Luke include this story? Is this Pauline fan fiction? Well, he's certainly shown in a very good light. And in fact, there's some vicarious salvation going in here, because on account of Paul, as the angel pronounced, everyone would be saved. And here we had a very concrete example of it where, in fact, everyone was saved because of Paul. Was it such a traumatic event that he participated in? Yeah, you live through something like this, you tell the story. Is there more symbolism at work in the story? Is this a primer about how to deal with special revelation and those who wield it? Now, there's a lot of symbolism in this story because, of course, the sea, as we've talked about before, is both a place that gives life and takes life away. We see this with the Sea of Galilee and the storms that come up with Jesus and the narrative with Jesus and the disciple. Now we're on a much larger sea. The sea is sort of this realm of chaos, and there's sort of a felt divinity about the sea, and there often is for the pagans in the ancient world. It expresses the will of the gods, and so, of course, that's what the Iliad saw. And with Jonah, of course, the sea expressed the will of God. And with Jesus, of course, the sea obeyed the will of God as through Jesus. The sea is subject to the will of Israel's God and his son. Now, Jonah in the boat, God commands the sea, and of course, when the pagans throw Jonah overboard, the sea gets calm. And then they praise the God of Israel. Now, God sets the stage for the revelation of his witness. Paul is not exempt from danger, and of course, neither was Jesus. Paul's mission, character, and wisdom is revealed in the peril. He is Christ's witness to the pagan sailors and to the Roman soldiers. There's a real connection here between Jonah's storm and Paul's storm. In this sense, well, Paul is going the right way, Jonah is going the wrong way, but Paul, God's gift to Paul, saves the soldiers, the prisoners, the sailors, the others who are on the ship. God is working through his will through the trial. Now, we might say, I prefer my journeys to be without trials, and of course we do. But then again, why do we keep retelling these stories? Why are these stories so interesting to us? Why do we love telling these stories so much that we make up stories like them? It's a very legitimate thing to ask. We all sort of want smooth sailing. And we can always ask for favor, but God has his own plans, and his plans are for his witness to this world. Now, Jonah's Jesus or Paul, it's interesting how they all sort of relate to one another, and the story sort of invites us to compare and contrast them all. God decides how to set the stage and to display his glory and to display his salvation, both realized salvation and anticipated salvation. It usually comes through trials and sufferings. This is finally deliverance story. All are saved on the boat, Christian and pagan alike, due to God's graciousness expressed to Paul and through Paul. This story also reminds me of the story where a man is let down through the roof to Jesus, and really the faith of his friends saves the man. The faith of Paul saves all of the lives on the ship. Now, if you can't be a person with faith, it might be a good idea to surround yourself with them. There's a little moral for the story. God's grace seems to splash out on those standing around. Now, the point of Bart Ehrman's book is quite interesting. I've mentioned this book in the past, and of course Bart Ehrman has his own story with respect to this, but one of the points that he makes in this book is that it is precisely these kinds of stories that, at least to a degree, changes the Roman Empire. God's agency is simply assumed by Paul and even the pagans around him, even though they would think about gods and divine forces and all of those kinds of things. They're not sort of subject to the atheistic secularity that we tend to hold as a social fact. Christians gained credibility because in their spiritual religious marketplace, they seem to have power and authority. And that clearly is one of the things that's going through here. And it's not alone in the book of Acts making this point. Paul is clearly portrayed in this way here, and he gains credibility with the centurion. But the larger warnings about the relationship between faith and miracles, well, they still hold. You're still going to be looking at people with skepticism, and just because people see a miracle doesn't mean they're necessarily going to have faith, or at least durable faith. In the light of the other biblical sea stories, there are other lessons. There will be storms. They seem to be part of God's plan for his witness. They always are. And you may not be spared them or even physically saved from them. That's part of the picture too. It happens all the time. And the stories don't always have happy endings with no lives lost. But God uses stilled storms and shipwrecks to move his mission along. God grants favor, but remember, he didn't even spare his own son, who gave himself for the sake of others. The path of faith has all the drama and agency of any other, if not more. Yet we can have confidence in the Lord of storms for his overall mission and for his care and love for us. Amen.